They seated me behind a thick pillar. Thinking out of sight meant out of mind. To my son and his ambitious new in-laws, I was just a 65-year-old widow ripe for financial slaughter. They forgot that for 30 years. I hunted white-collar criminals for a living. As my son raised a glass to toast his deception, a federal agent quietly pulled up a chair next to me, and I watched the color drain from his face. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am a 65-year-old widow, and I have learned that silence is often the loudest sound in a room, especially when that room is a ballroom at the Silvercrest Grand in Dallas. I wore a simple navy suit, tailored and clean, standing in sharp contrast to the explosion of sequins and silk around me. My heritage is Nordic, and perhaps that is why I have always preferred the cold. It keeps things preserved. It keeps things clear. Today, clarity was the only weapon I brought with me to the wedding of my only son, Daniel. The ballroom was designed to intimidate. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, hung from the ceiling, refracting light into 1,000 blinding daggers. A 12-piece orchestra played something classical and expensive in the corner, drowning out the murmured gossip of 300 guests. To the casual observer, this was a fairy tale. To me, it looked like a crime scene that hadn't been taped off yet. The flowers were too fragrant, masking the scent of decay. The smiles were too wide, stretching skin tight over secrets. A young waiter, who looked terrified of making a mistake, guided me through the maze of tables. We walked past the front rows, past the extended family of the bride, past the business associates, until we reached the very edge of the room. He pulled out a chair at table 23. Directly in front of me stood a structural pillar, 3 feet wide, completely blocking my view of the stage and the head table. It was not an accident. It was a calculated architectural insult. I was being told, in the language of event planning, that I was merely an obligation to be hidden away. I did not flinch. I did not demand to speak to the manager. I simply sat down, placing my small, hard-shell clutch on the table. Inside, nestled between a packet of tissues and my lipstick, was a phone with military-grade encryption and a Mont Blanc pen that doubled as a high-fidelity directional microphone. I was not here to celebrate a union. I was here to document a felony. My heart did not ache with maternal sorrow. It beat with the steady, slow rhythm of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. I had spent 30 years investigating financial fraud, dissecting the lives of men much smarter than my son and women much more ruthless than his bride. They saw a lonely old woman. I saw targets. From the edge of my obstructed view, I caught a glimpse of Harper Lane. At 34, my new daughter-in-law was radiant, holding court in the center of the room like a queen bee. Her mother, Vivian, moved around her like a general, barking orders at the staff with a smile that never reached her eyes. They were confident. They were victorious. I watched as Vivian leaned in to whisper to a man in a grey suit, Randall Pierce, their family lawyer. They were discussing the papers, the ones they planned to force me to sign once the cake was cut and the champagne had dulled my senses. Daniel stood near them, but he wasn't smiling. He kept adjusting his tie, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the corner where he knew I was sitting. He looked like a man waiting for the guillotine, not a honeymoon. He knew what they were planning to do to me tonight. He knew. And he had let it happen because he was weak and in debt up to his eyes. The pillar was their way of saying I no longer belonged in the center of this family. I accepted that. Being on the periphery meant they weren't watching me. The orchestra swelled for the toasts. Just then, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall opened. A woman walked in. She was not on the guest list. She wore a charcoal pantsuit that meant business, not celebration. She moved with the economy of motion that only federal agents possess. She walked straight to my table, ignored the confused glance of the other guests, and whispered something to a passing server. He immediately, almost frantically, dragged a chair over and placed it right next to mine. On stage. Daniel tapped the microphone. The feedback whined, silencing the crowd. He raised his glass, a trembling hand holding the champagne. "I would like to thank everyone for coming," he started, his voice thin. Then, he looked out into the crowd. His eyes scanned the back of the room and landed on table 23. He saw me. And then, he saw who had just joined me. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked like a magic trick. He turned a shade of white that matched the tablecloths. His hand spasmed, and the microphone slipped, caught only by his other hand in a clumsy fumble that sent a boom of static through the speakers. He stared at the woman sitting next to his mother, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. I picked up my glass of ice water. I did not look at the stage. I looked at the reflection in the silverware, calm and cold. The pillar hid me from the room, but it didn't hide the room from me. Good, I thought. The final phase has begun. To understand why I was sitting behind a pillar at the Silvercrest Grand, you have to rewind the clock a few months. I was living alone in the rambling colonial house in the suburbs of Woodbridge. It was the house my late husband, Thomas, and I had spent a lifetime paying off, one paycheck at a time. Every shingle and floorboard represented a sacrifice we had made together. To the neighbours, I was just Margaret, the quiet widow who tended to her hydrangeas and drove a 10-year-old sedan. They saw the grief, but they missed the steel underneath. They did not know that for 30 years. I was a senior fraud investigator for the Redstone Integrity Group. My career was not built on baking cookies. It was built on tearing apart complex financial structures to find the rot hidden inside. I specialized in white-collar crime, exposing executives who thought they could hide embezzlement behind shell companies and creative accounting. I spent 3 decades learning that the most dangerous criminals often wore the most expensive suits and smiled the widest. Then there was Daniel, my son. He had been a sweet boy, but he grew into a man who was allergic to hard work. He always sought the path of least resistance. I had quietly bailed him out of credit card debt twice during his college years, hoping he would learn. He never did. After Thomas died of a sudden stroke, Daniel drifted away, only to return with a newfound intensity once he started dating Harper. Harper Lane was a marketing manager at the Valora Collective, a high-end fashion group. She was sharp, stylish, and immediately diagnosed that I was too old to live alone. The campaign began slowly. First, Daniel offered to help manage my monthly utility bills to take the burden off my shoulders. Then, Harper began dropping comments about how difficult probate court was and how smart it would be to transfer the deed of the house to Daniel now to ensure a smooth inheritance later. She masked her impatience with a veneer of concern, but I recognized the tone. It was the same tone guilty CEOs used when they tried to rush me through an audit. I did not confront them. I did what I have always done. I opened a file. I started digging into my own son's finances. The reality was worse than I feared. Daniel was not just broke. He was drowning. He had taken out high-interest loans from predatory lenders to cover massive losses in a cryptocurrency scheme that had gone bust. He owed over $60,000, and the interest was compounding daily. Then I looked at Harper. She was living a lifestyle her salary could not support. I found discrepancies in the public financial reports of the Valora Collective that suggested someone in regional marketing was inflating sales figures to trigger unearned commission bonuses. She was desperate for cash before the next quarterly audit exposed her. I realized I could not do the physical legwork alone, so I hired Rhea Collins. Rhea was a private investigator, young, hungry, and brilliant with digital surveillance. She monitored their emails and calendar invites. The picture she painted was damning. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a deadline. They had scheduled a private meeting immediately after the ceremony to pressure me into signing a full, durable power of attorney. They planned to sell my house within 3 months and use the equity to wipe out Daniel's debts and cover Harper's tracks. Rhea dug deeper into Harper's family. Vivian and Gregory Lane, my future in-laws, were not the wealthy socialites they pretended to be. They were grifters. Rhea found a sealed record of a fraudulent bankruptcy in Florida 7 years ago. They had managed to liquidate and hide assets in shell companies right before the court froze their accounts. It was a genetic trait, it seemed. The pattern was clear to me. A predatory family had identified a host. They saw a grieving widow with a paid-off house and a healthy pension, and they attached themselves to her through her weak-willed son. I remember sitting in my kitchen the night I put all the pieces together. My hand trembled as I held my coffee cup, a betrayal of my aging nerves. But my mind was as cold as a winter frost. They thought they were dealing with a helpless mother who would sign anything to keep her son close. They did not know they were picking a fight with a woman who had sent men to federal prison for less. I stared at the wall and thought that if they wanted to play by the rules of legal paperwork, I would show them exactly how sharp those edges could be. I met Owen Prescott at a small, nondescript coffee shop 3 towns over from Woodbridge to avoid being seen. Owen is 72 years old, a man cut from granite and old leather, and he was one of the few people my late husband trusted implicitly. We did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the timeline of Daniel's betrayal, and Owen listened with the stillness of a judge. When I finished, he did not offer pity. He offered a strategy. He proposed the immediate creation of the Emily and Thomas Holloway Trust, named after my husband and his mother. We would move everything into it, the deed to the house, my investment portfolio, and the life insurance policies would all be retitled under the trust's ownership. The key was the beneficiary designation. It would not be Daniel. I decided that the sole beneficiary would be the Heartland Shield Foundation, a new non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid to elderly victims of financial abuse. It was a decision that felt right in my bones. Everything Thomas and I had built would go towards fighting the very crime my son was attempting to commit against me. Owen prepared the paperwork with terrifying speed. We signed everything at a notary's office the next afternoon. He gave me a strict order that no one, absolutely no one, was to know this trust existed until the trap was sprung. To Daniel and Harper, I had to remain the confused, vulnerable widow holding on to assets they could easily snatch. While Owen fortified the legal walls, Rhea went to work on the physical ones. She arrived at my house in an unmarked van and installed lawful, high-definition micro-cameras throughout the property. She hid them in the crown molding of the living room, behind a spice rack in the kitchen, and tucked into the eaves of the front porch. She even placed one in the secret reading room in the basement, a sanctuary Daniel had forgotten existed. My home was no longer just a shelter. It was an evidence collection facility. I also prepared my personal arsenal. I ordered a high-end fountain pen online. To the naked eye, it was a luxury writing instrument. But inside, it housed a directional microphone and a digital recorder capable of capturing whispers from 10 feet away. It was the tool I would use to record my own execution warrant. Or rather, what they thought would be my execution warrant. Before the final stage, I needed to be sure. I needed to know if there was any part of my son left inside the man who was plotting against me. I arranged an anonymous transfer through a shell account to pay off 70% of Daniel's shark loan debts. It was a massive sum, enough to give anyone a fresh start. I called it the final character test. I waited to see if he would come to me, confess his troubles, and tell me that a miracle had happened. I waited for him to use that breathing room to break free from Harper's toxic influence. He did not. Daniel never mentioned the money. Instead, Ria's surveillance showed that he treated the anonymous bailout as divine intervention. He did not pay down the rest of the debt. He borrowed more. Harper, believing their financial bleeding had stopped, accelerated her spending. She leased a brand new luxury SUV and put a deposit down on a penthouse apartment she could not afford. They interpreted my mercy as luck, and they used that luck to dig a deeper hole. That was the moment the mother in me finally stepped aside for the investigator. I moved a modest sum of $20,000 into an old checking account I knew Daniel had access to, leaving it there as bait. It was a decoy to make them believe my liquid assets were still sitting there, unprotected and ready for the taking. I decided then that I would not stop them quietly. I would let them walk their plan all the way to the end. The wedding was where they wanted to announce that Daniel would be taking over my estate. They wanted an audience. So, I decided to give them one. I would let them drag me to that altar of greed. But I would make sure there were enough witnesses, cameras, and microphones to record the exact moment the trap snapped shut. They wanted a show. I would give them a tragedy. The first tactical strike arrived disguised as a phone call. Harper rang me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that set my teeth on edge. She claimed that due to unexpected budget constraints, they would only be able to allocate a single table for the groom's family. She framed it as an unfortunate necessity, but I knew exactly what it was. She was corralling my relatives into a dark corner to make room for her father's business associates in the center. We were being erased from the narrative before the first bottle of champagne was even popped. Then came the email from Daniel. It was written with a sterile, corporate tone that I knew he had not drafted himself. He requested that I grant him signing authority on my primary checking account to facilitate immediate payments for wedding vendors. He claimed it was for convenience. I played the part of the befuddled old woman perfectly. I sent him incomplete forms, signed on the wrong lines, and mailed them to his old address. I bought myself time with incompetence, a shield they were all too eager to believe in. The humiliation escalated when Vivian, Harper's mother, invited me to a final dress fitting. She did not ask me what I wanted to wear. She presented me with a dress the color of oatmeal. It was a shapeless, beige garment designed to make me blend seamlessly into the tablecloths. She told me it was elegant and understated, insisting that I would not want to clash with the bridal party or steal the spotlight. I stepped into the changing booth, leaving the curtain slightly ajar. That was when I heard it. Vivian was speaking to the event coordinator just outside. Her voice was low, but my hearing has always been sharp. She said that I was only there for appearances. She said that after the wedding, Daniel's house would belong to the kids, and she would personally arrange for the interior to be gutted and modernized. She spoke of my home, the sanctuary Thomas and I had built, as if it were already a vacant lot awaiting her command. I looked at myself in the mirror. The beige dress hung on me like a shroud. I saw the deep wrinkles and the grey hair. But beneath that, I saw the eyes of the woman who had stared down cartel accountants. I took the dress off. I would not wear their uniform of submission. I decided then and there to wear a tailored navy suit. I would not look like a mother of the groom. I would look like a witness for the prosecution. Ria delivered the next piece of intelligence later that night. She had intercepted an email chain between Harper and her personal attorney, Randall Pierce. The subject line referenced a post-ceremony meeting. The plan was explicitly laid out. Immediately after the vows, while the guests were moving to the cocktail hour, they would pull me into the VIP suite for a quiet signing session. They framed it as transferring financial stewardship to Daniel to ensure my security. In reality, it was a complete abdication of my rights. I showed the emails to Owen. We did not get angry. We got to work. We drafted a document that looked identical to the power of attorney Pierce had prepared. The font, the headers, and the layout were a perfect match. However, the legal language inside was an irrevocable refusal of power of attorney and a declaration of independence. It was a landmine disguised as a gift. With the trap set, I needed one final element. I needed the law. I sent a private, encrypted message to Nora Gallagher. Nora was a federal agent with the Elder Fraud Task Force, and she had been building a case against Vivian and Gregory for their fraudulent bankruptcy for 2 years. She just needed a smoking gun to tie them to a new crime. I told Nora that if she wanted to catch the entire family in an active conspiracy with full video evidence, she should come to my son's wedding. I told her I would be the woman sitting behind the large pillar at table 23. I told her to look for the small, jagged scar on my left hand, a souvenir from a paper cutter incident in the 90s. I held the heavy cream-coloured wedding invitation in my hand. The calligraphy was beautiful, swirling and gold. But as I ran my thumb over the raised lettering, I knew what it really was. This was not an invitation. It was a summons to a trial, and they had no idea they were the ones on the docket. The morning of the wedding arrived with a grey, overcast sky that felt entirely appropriate. I took a standard rideshare to St. Matthew's Chapel, deliberately rejecting the stretch limousine Vivian had sent for me. She had framed it as a gesture of luxury, but I knew it was a containment measure. They wanted to control my arrival just as they intended to control my departure. I preferred the anonymity of a stranger's sedan. I would not accept a ride from the people planning to drive me into bankruptcy. When I found Daniel in the vestry, he looked like a man trying to hold smoke in his bare hands. He refused to meet my eyes, mumbling a few rehearsed pleasantries about how nice I looked before turning away to adjust cufflinks that were already perfect. Harper was even colder. She gave me a hug that involved no physical contact, her body rigid, and whispered that I should make sure to take my seat promptly so I would not be in the way of the photographers. I was an obstacle to be managed, not a mother to be honoured. During the ceremony, I sat in the middle rows, a calculated distance from the front. It was close enough to see the sweat beading on my son's forehead, but far enough back that the videographers hired by the bride's family could easily crop me out of the frame. I watched the altar, but my focus was peripheral. I tracked the silent communication between Harper and Randall Pierce, her lawyer, who sat 3 rows back on the groom's side. They exchanged nods and glances that had nothing to do with holy matrimony and everything to do with the contract awaiting me. When the priest asked who gave the bride away, Vivian stood up with a flourish, beaming as if she had personally invented the concept of marriage. She did not glance at me. It was a symbolic erosha, a public declaration that this union belonged to the Lane family alone. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of polite indifference. Inside, I was merely adding another line item to the indictment building in my head. The reception at the Silvercrest Grand was a study in excess. While the rest of the guests were ushered to tables surrounding the dance floor, a hostess with a tight smile led me to table 23. It was situated at the very edge of the room, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen and directly behind a massive structural pillar. My view of the head table was completely blocked. The place card did not even bear my name. It simply read, "Groom's mother," in a generic script. I sat down and quietly went to work. I twisted the barrel of my pen, activating the high-fidelity microphone. I checked my encrypted phone under the table. A message from Owen was waiting. It read that the prey was all accounted for, and Nora was inside. I glanced to my right and saw the empty chair the waiter had just placed there per Nora's instructions. On the stage, I could not see. Harper's voice boomed through the speakers. She thanked her parents, her friends, and the corporate sponsors who had allegedly contributed to the gift bags. She listed everyone who had supported them financially. My name was never spoken, despite the fact that I had paid for every semester of Daniel's college education. Then Daniel took the microphone. His voice shook slightly as he recited a speech that sounded like it had been drafted by a PR firm. He spoke of new beginnings. He said that from this day forward, he and Harper were building a family and standing on their own 2 feet. The irony was so thick, it almost choked me. They were standing on a trapdoor of debt, and they were planning to use my spine as the ladder to climb out. The videographer swept through the room, capturing the laughter and the toasts. As the camera panned toward table 23, I saw the lens dip and move quickly past the pillar, ensuring I remained a ghost in the footage. It was exactly what they wanted. But in the shadow of that pillar, I was typing a final message to my team. I wrote that I was ready and that they would make their move after the speeches concluded. My phone buzzed with a reply from Rhea. She confirmed that Harper had just signaled Randall to prepare the dossier in the VIP room. They thought I would sign my life away before the first dance. They had no idea that Nora had already activated her own recording device and was walking toward my table at that very second. A young server appeared at my elbow, bending down to whisper that the bride and groom needed a quick word with me in private. I feigned a moment of confusion, blinking rapidly as if the noise of the reception had disoriented me. I reached out and gripped the young man's arm to steady myself, putting on a performance of frailty that would have won an award. In that split second of contact, using his body as a shield from the room, I activated the backup micro recorder taped to the inside of my wrist. I expected them to lead me to the bridal suite, or perhaps a quiet conference room. I was wrong. Harper was waiting for me in the shadows directly behind the structural pillar, a few feet from the service entrance. It was a dark, cramped corner, occupied by a single high-top cocktail table that looked like it was being used to stack dirty dishes. This was where they thought I belonged. Not at the head table, but in the service corridor. Harper did not waste time on pleasantries. She stepped into my personal space, her perfume overpowering in the stagnant air. Her voice was sweet, but it was the cloying sweetness of rotting fruit. She said that they knew how much I hated complicated paperwork. So they had asked their lawyer to make everything very simple for me. She told me all I had to do was sign the bottom line, and they would handle the rest, so I would never have to worry about a single bill again. Daniel was standing right behind her, staring at his shoes. He mumbled that it was just a standard power of attorney to help them pay the utility bills. He said the house was too big, and managing it alone was too hard for me. He sounded like a child reciting a lesson he had been forced to memorize. Randall Pierce stepped forward and slammed a thick dossier onto the small cocktail table. He flipped the pages rapidly, his hand conveniently covering the top half of the document, and pointed a manicured finger at the signature block. But my eyes were faster than his hand. I saw the bold print at the top of the page which read, "Irrevocable General Power of Attorney." Before I could speak, Vivian emerged from the shadows like a shark sensing blood. She placed a cold hand on my shoulder and spoke in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. She said she understood the grief of losing a husband and how easy it was for widows to be taken advantage of. She claimed she just wanted to protect me from scammers and that I should let the children take over so I could rest. I picked up the pen, letting my hand tremble violently. I looked at Harper and asked her quietly what would happen if I chose not to sign. The mask dropped instantly. Harper's face hardened into a sneer. Her voice lost all its warmth and became a razor. She told me that if I did not sign, they would have no choice but to file a petition with the court declaring me incompetent. She said they would testify that I was becoming forgetful, that I was a danger to myself, and that I needed to be made a ward of the state. Daniel, looking like a cornered animal, suddenly snapped. He blurted out that I needed to stop being so selfish. He shouted that this was the only way to save the entire family from financial ruin, admitting in his panic that the goal was not to help me, but to use my assets to pay off their crushing debts. Harper silenced him with a glare, and then turned the full force of her venom on me. She leaned in close, her teeth bared. She said she did not care if I was sad or lonely. She told me that all the resources were sitting uselessly with me while they were the future. She hissed that there was no point in me keeping the house because sooner or later, I was going to end up in a nursing home anyway, so I might as well make myself useful before I was sent away. I stopped trembling. I placed the pen gently on the table and lifted my head. My spine straightened, and the fog I had pretended to be lost in evaporated. I looked Harper dead in the eye, my gaze steady and clear. I told them that was good. I told them that they had finally said exactly what they were thinking, and that the last part had been recorded very clearly. Harper let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed in the cramped space behind the pillar. She looked at me with genuine pity, the kind a predator feels for a mouse that decides to squeak before it dies. "Recording," she scoffed, shaking her head as she smoothed the silk of her wedding dress. "Do you really think a few choppy audio clips are going to stop us? You are a 65-year-old woman, Margaret, in court. You will look like exactly what you are, a paranoid, lonely widow terrified of being left behind. No judge is going to take your side against a young couple trying to care for you. You are delusional." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached up and adjusted the lapel of my jacket, ensuring the lens of the button camera had a clear line of sight. Then, I shifted my gaze past Harper's shoulder, toward the thick structural pillar and the empty chair that had been placed at my table just minutes before. "I think the delusion is entirely yours," I said softly, before Harper could reach for the dossier again. A voice cut through the air. It was low, feminine, and carried the unmistakable weight of authority. I disagree, the voice said. I have heard enough, and I am confident the federal prosecutor will feel the same way. Harper spun around, her heels scraping against the concrete floor. From the deep shadow of the pillar, Nora Gallagher stepped into the harsh light of the service corridor. She was not wearing a festive gown. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a lanyard that she now pulled from beneath her jacket. The badge caught the light, silver and serious. She placed a small digital memory card on the cocktail table, right on top of the coercive power of attorney documents. Special Agent Nora Gallagher, she announced, her tone flat and professional. Elder Fraud Task Force, Financial Crimes Division. Daniel looked at the badge, then at me, and his legs seemed to liquidate. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "Mom," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You invited the FBI to my wedding." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and felt a final, severing snap in my chest. "Not the FBI. Daniel," I corrected him calmly. "This is the unit that specializes in helping people like me escape from children like you." Nora did not give them time to process. She pulled a notebook from her pocket and began to read, her voice cutting over the distant sound of the reception band playing a jazz standard. Subject Harper Lane stated, "All the resources are sitting with you." Subject also stated, "Sooner or later, you will end up in a nursing home." And subject Daniel Holloway admitted the intent was to save the entire family from debt. These statements directly corroborate the forensic accounting evidence we have already gathered regarding the embezzlement of funds at the Valora Collective. Vivian Lane, who had been standing like a statue, suddenly lunged forward. Her face was flushed with a mix of rage and terror. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, trying to keep her voice down so the guests on the other side of the partition would not hear. "This is a private family dispute. If you try to arrest anyone here, I will sue you and this old hag for defamation and emotional distress." Nora turned her gaze to Vivian. It was a look that could have frozen water. "Mrs. Lane, you have been under surveillance since your fraudulent bankruptcy filing in Florida 7 years ago. We know about the offshore accounts. Tonight. By coercing a senior citizen into signing legal documents under duress, you have just added yourself to a brand new federal indictment." Randall Pierce, the lawyer, stepped in front of Vivian, holding up his hands. "Agent, we need to pause this immediately. Anything discussed here is protected by attorney-client privilege. You cannot use..." "That privilege does not apply when the attorney is an active participant in the commission of a crime," Nora interrupted, pulling a folded document from her inner pocket. "I have a warrant, authorized by a federal judge 3 days ago, based on Mrs. Holloway's sworn affidavit. We have been recording legally for the last 40 minutes." The dynamic in the cramped corridor shifted violently. Moments ago, I was the victim, pressed against the wall by 4 people who wanted to strip me of my dignity. Now, I took a step forward. I moved away from the shadows and stood in the center of the small space. Owen Prescott, my lawyer, appeared silently from behind the service doors, flanking me on the left while Nora stood on my right. We formed a wall. On the other side stood my son, his new wife, her mother, and their crooked lawyer. The lights from the main hall spilled over the partition, illuminating their pale, sweating faces. A few waiters had stopped working and were staring openly at the scene, witnesses to the collapse of the facade. Nora raised her hand in a subtle signal. across the room, near the VIP exit doors that led to the private parking lot. Two men in dark suits, hotel security, who had been briefed on the operation, quietly turned the deadbolts and stood in front of the glass. "No one is leaving," Nora said. "The exits have been secured." The jazz band cut out abruptly, leaving a saxophone note hanging in the dead air like a question mark. The master of ceremonies, looking pale after a brief word with one of the security team, tapped his microphone and announced that we had to pause the program for an urgent security matter. The chatter of 300 guests died down instantly. Heads turned, necks craned. The spotlight, which had been dancing over the cake, swung around and hit the pillar at table 23, illuminating our standoff. Vivian was the first to scramble for damage control. She rushed to the stage, snatching the microphone from the confused MC. Her smile was manic, a rictus of panic. She told the crowd that this was just a small family misunderstanding, a bit of drama that happens at every wedding, and begged everyone to please continue enjoying the champagne. But Nora did not let her finish. She stepped out from the shadow of the pillar, her federal badge raised high, catching the light like a shield. She spoke clearly, her voice projecting without a microphone, silencing Vivian mid-sentence. She announced that this was an active federal investigation, not a family dispute. Vivian froze. Nora walked toward the center of the room, flanked by two uniformed officers who had just entered from the lobby. She introduced herself and the Elder Fraud Task Force. Then, she dropped the hammer. She announced to the room that they had irrefutable evidence of a conspiracy to coerce a 65-year-old woman into transferring her assets under the guise of care. She stated plainly that the motive was to cover significant gambling debts and to conceal active embezzlement. The room gasped. It was a collective sound, like the air being sucked out of a balloon. Daniel, realizing his narrative was crumbling, lunged for the microphone in Vivian's hand. He screamed that it was a lie. He pointed a shaking finger at the pillar where I was still standing. He shouted that he was only trying to protect me, that I was mentally slipping, and that I was playing the victim to ruin his wedding because I had never approved of his choice of bride. I felt a strange calmness settle over me. I walked past the service table, past the stunned waiters, and approached the stage. I did not shout. I simply asked the MC for his handheld microphone. He gave it to me without hesitation. I looked at my son. I told him, in a voice that reached every corner of the ballroom, that I was not the one who needed protection. I reminded him that 5 years ago, I had bailed him out of his first major financial disaster. I revealed that on that day, he had signed a contract. He had accepted $100,000 in cash in exchange for voluntarily removing himself from the family trust. The silence in the hall was absolute. Owen stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers high. He read the clause aloud. The language was precise and brutal. It stated that Daniel Holloway had voluntarily renounced all rights to any inheritance or assets belonging to the Emily and Thomas Holloway Trust. He confirmed the document was notarized, witnessed, and legally binding. Harper, seeing her financial lifeboat sinking, grabbed the mic from Daniel. She tried to pivot. She accused me of being a tyrant, a controlling mother who used money to manipulate her children because she did not know how to love them. She claimed I had never trusted them. I did not respond with words. I nodded to Nora. Nora pressed a button on her tablet, which was connected to the room's audio system. The recording we had captured 10 minutes ago blasted through the speakers. Harper's voice, crisp and cruel, echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The guests heard her say clearly that she did not care if I was sad or not. They heard her say that all the resources were sitting with me while they were the future. They heard her sneer that I was going to end up in a nursing home anyway. The reaction was instantaneous. At the back tables, my cousins and old friends stood up, staring at the stage with open disgust. Daniel's college friends, the ones who had been cheering loudest an hour ago, quietly backed away, putting distance between themselves and the groom. Nora took the floor one last time. She announced that due to the flight risk associated with the offshore accounts linked to the Lane family, she was executing an immediate temporary seizure of passports for Harper Lane and Vivian Lane. She declared that all assets were being frozen, pending a full forensic audit, and that the court would be issuing an emergency protective order for my finances. Harper stood center stage in her $50,000 custom gown, paralyzed. She was surrounded not by well-wishers, but by lawyers and federal agents. The guests began to grab their purses and coats, scurrying toward the exits to avoid being deposed. The wedding was over. The pre-trial hearing had begun. The fallout from the wedding was immediate and digital, within 48 hours. A grainy cell phone video of Nora flashing her badge and shutting down the reception had circulated across local news sites and social media platforms. To the public, it was just another slice of viral drama, a rich family imploding for the internet's amusement. They saw the spectacle, but they did not understand the layers of forensic accounting and legal strategy that had engineered that moment. I returned to my house in Woodbridge, and the silence that greeted me felt heavier than usual. I received bouquets of lilies from a few old friends who whispered their support. But my inbox was also filled with anonymous messages from strangers. They called me heartless. They accused me of ruining my son's life over money. They did not understand that a mother's job is not just to nurture, but to teach. And sometimes the lesson is survival. 2 days later, Owen and Nora sat in my library. We spread the files out on the oak table like generals mapping a war zone. We had 3 distinct targets. The primary objective remained the absolute protection of the Emily and Thomas Holloway Trust. The secondary objective was the criminal prosecution of Harper, Vivian, and their lawyer, Randall Pierce. Then there was the variable, Daniel. Nora dropped a bombshell about Randall. Her team had uncovered evidence that he had been using the assets of his elderly clients to unknowingly guarantee high-risk loans for Harper and her mother. It was a Ponzi scheme built on the graves of the senile. Randall and Harper were looking at serious prison time if we pushed for the maximum charges. Owen took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with tired, kind eyes and asked the question I knew was coming. He wanted to know how far I wanted to push Daniel. He said we had enough to bury him alongside his wife and mother-in-law as a full co-conspirator. He asked if I wanted to leave a door open for him to come back. I looked up at the wall, where a framed photograph of Daniel still hung. He was 5 years old in the picture, missing a front tooth, holding a plastic shovel on a beach trip we took before Thomas got sick. I felt a crack in my composure, a sharp, physical pain in my chest. The tragedy wasn't that they tried to take my house. It was that my son had looked at his options and chosen the money over me. He had made a calculation, and I was the remainder to be discarded. I took a breath and gave Owen my terms. I told him I would not ask the prosecutor for the maximum sentence for Daniel on one condition. He had to flip. He had to become the state's star witness. He had to admit everything, detailing every conversation, every plan, and every act of coercion orchestrated by Harper and Vivian. If he cooperated fully, the law would view him as a victimized accomplice rather than a mastermind. The night before the preliminary hearing, my security system alerted me to motion at the front gate. I pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. It was Daniel. He was standing there in the dark, looking at the house where he grew up. He looked thinner, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his choices. He stood there for 20 minutes. He never rang the bell. I sat in my armchair, watching him on the screen. A part of me wanted to run out there, to open the gate and let him cry on my shoulder. But I stayed seated. If I opened that door, I would be the mother who enables. Tonight, I had to be the witness who testifies. I texted Owen a simple message. I told him to tell Daniel's public defender that if my son wanted to speak to me, he should do it in the courtroom. I wrote that I did not need a private apology. I needed the truth to be spoken on the record, where it actually had value. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I ironed the same navy suit I had worn to the wedding. I did not choose it for vanity. I chose it as a reminder. The wedding and the courtroom were just two different fronts of the same battle. I buttoned the jacket, checked my reflection, and prepared to face the ruins of my family. I was not going there to win. I was going there to finish it. The trial opened with a roll call of greed. Harper, Vivian, Randall, and Daniel sat at the defense table, facing a laundry list of charges that included conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and grand larceny. In Harper's case, the prosecutor added a heavy charge of corporate embezzlement from the Valora Collective. The courtroom was silent as the state played the video evidence. On the large monitors, the jury watched the wedding footage Nora and I had compiled. They saw Harper bullying me into the corner. They heard Daniel accuse me of selfishness while demanding my money. They heard Vivian sketch out a future for me in a nursing home so they could gut my house. It was a seamless narrative of predation. Daniel took the stand first. He looked gaunt, his suit hanging loosely on a frame that had shrunk from stress. Under oath, he crumbled. He admitted to the gambling debts. He admitted that he had viewed me not as a mother, but as a financial lifeline. He confessed that he knew Harper had targeted my home from the very first time she mentioned marriage. Then, in a twist that sucked the air out of the room, Daniel decided to burn the whole ship down. He testified that Harper had been falsifying sales data for 2 years. He revealed that Vivian was hiding assets in shell accounts to avoid creditors. He even detailed how Randall had legally advised them on how to declare me incompetent to expedite the power of attorney transfer. Harper's defense attorney tried to salvage the wreckage. He attempted to paint Daniel as a bitter ex-husband, trying to scapegoat his wife to save his own skin. But the evidence was insurmountable. The emails, the bank transfers, and the payroll records perfectly matched Daniel's testimony. The picture was clear. This was not a family. It was a criminal enterprise. When it was my turn to speak as the victim, I did not bring tissues. I stood straight, smoothing the lapels of my navy suit. I spoke in a steady, even tone. I told the judge about my 30 years as a fraud investigator. I told him how many times I had seen the elderly stripped of their dignity by strangers, but that I never imagined I would have to build a case against my own blood. I explained that I had prepared for this wedding like a raid because I had no other choice. I looked directly at the judge and delivered my final verdict on my son. I told the court that I was not asking for leniency for Daniel. I asked the judge to see him as a man who had chosen weakness at every turn. I said that I had given him a chance to be honest when I anonymously paid his debts, and he had chosen betrayal instead. I said clearly that I could not save a person who refused to stand up. The sentencing was swift. Harper received the longest prison term as the primary architect of the scheme. Vivian and Randall were given shorter sentences, but faced heavy restitution and long-term probation. Daniel, thanks to his cooperation, received a reduced sentence to be served in a correctional rehabilitation facility, coupled with mandatory counselling. As the bailiffs led them away, Daniel turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, filled with panic and a desperate silent plea for reassurance. He wanted me to rush to the railing, to hug him, to tell him that I would be waiting with a hot meal when he got out. I did not move. I simply shook my head once. A small, final gesture. I did not offer him forgiveness. I offered him the consequences he had earned. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright midday sun. Owen was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. He handed me a thick manila envelope. It was the final confirmation. The Emily and Thomas Holloway Trust was secure, locked down tight. Upon my passing, every cent would transfer directly to the Heartland Shield Foundation. I ran my hand over the cool paper of the envelope. I did not feel triumphant. I felt light. I had not won because I was cruel. I had won because I had the courage to draw a line, even when it meant cutting off my own son. I finished the day at a small diner on the edge of town. I asked for a table in the corner, but this time, no one was trying to hide me. I ordered a coffee, opened a fresh notebook, and uncapped my pen. On the first blank page, I wrote the title of my next project, A Legal Survival Guide for Elderly Parents with Ungrateful Children. Thanks so much for listening to my story. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. Drop a comment down below and let me know where you are tuning in from. I would love to hear from you. Please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.